Thank you all very much. A few thank yous before I get started here. I'd like to thank Michelle for sponsoring the event, Tracy and Ashley for arranging things, John for selling the books, and most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening. What looks like a very nice summer evening, although I guess it looks like rain. So we'll see. My talk is about the 32nd Infantry Division during World War II. I want to try to give the general overview of the division's history. We'll talk about the battles and those sorts of things, and I'll try to give the big picture. But I also want to give some Waupaca County perspectives. And I have to say I'm a little intimidated because I'm not from Waupaca. I've driven down Highway 10 many times. We went camping once at the chain of lakes. So I hope I do your town justice. Let's all keep our fingers crossed. All right. So in Wisconsin today, if we look around, we can find all kinds of memorials and monuments and reminders of the 32nd Division, even if we don't notice them or even if we don't recognize them. For example, I grew up in Manitowoc. I grew up in the eastern part of Wisconsin, and this was a very common sight, and I suspect some of you have seen this highway sign as well. This is the sign for Highway 32 that runs from the Kenosha County up north. It looks like any ordinary highway sign that you might find, except you'll notice the red arrows on there. That highway is a memorial to the 32nd Division. If you look in local parks, you can oftentimes find memorials to the division. You can find Red Arrow parks across the state. Just this afternoon, I went to Red Arrow Park in Oshkosh. Perhaps some of you have seen that as well. So these things are all around us, but we oftentimes don't pay very much attention. And we should, because the 32nd Division had a remarkable record during the Second World War. It served the entirety of the conflict. It was mobilized before Pearl Harbor. It served on occupation duty in Japan up until 1946, so almost 6 years of active service. It experienced some very important firsts in American military history that we'll talk about tonight. It served more time in combat than any other Army division during the Second World War. Now, I'm a historian. I study World War II in particular, and especially the social and cultural history of soldiers. And in the course of my research, I noticed that there really wasn't very much written about the 32nd Division, even though it had this very important role in the Second World War, and of course is very important to communities across the state as well. I was talking to some people just before the event here tonight who said they had relatives who served in the 32nd Division. I do as well. This is my great uncle Andrew from Port Washington. He served in the 127th Infantry Regiment. Unfortunately, he was wounded in action and then died a few days later. And I know many people in this room and in the community have family members who served in the division. So it's something that's very deeply woven into the fabric of Wisconsin life. So to try to fill in a gap in World War II history, and provide more information to people who had relatives in the division, I decided that I would write this book. And so we'll talk about the division's history tonight. Let's start with some background before we get to World War II, because that was not the only conflict in which the Red Arrow participated. It also played a very important role in the First World War. It was created in 1917, just as the United States enters the conflict. It was made up of National Guard soldiers from Wisconsin and Michigan, so we cannot forget our friends across the lake either. They were a very important part of the 32nd Division, and they had a very impressive record in the First World War. Every time the 32nd Division went into action against the Germans, it managed to pierce German lines. It always moved forward. And to commemorate this, when the division developed an emblem, they developed the one you see here. It's a red arrow pointing upwards, and you'll notice the horizontal bar across the shaft. That horizontal bar represents the German lines that the division crossed. And from this point on, the division would be known as the Red Arrow Division. So it's the 32nd Red Arrow Division. It stayed intact after the war into the 1920s and 1930s, but after World War I, military affairs were not very popular. Budgets for the military were not ample, shall we say, and the division's training, its readiness fell off in the years between the wars. But the 1930s, as I'm sure many of you know, the world starts to become a much more dangerous place. Japan resumes its expansionism across East Asia. There was the rise of fascism in Europe, in Germany and Italy in particular. And I might note that Japanese militarism had a lot of similarities to European fascism as well. And these were very brutal dictatorial regimes, and they were expansionistic. So the world is becoming more dangerous. War breaks out in Europe in 1939. By that time, Japan and China were already fighting, and so much of the world is already at war. The United States was not in the war yet, but President Roosevelt and others in Washington believed that America had to be better prepared in case something bad happens and in case the United States gets ensnared in this war. And so Washington does several things. They begin the draft, for example, in 1940. And another thing that the government did to prepare America for a potential war was to mobilize the National Guard for training. Again, its training had fallen off. It needed to get up to speed. And so the National Guard was called up. The 32nd Division was called up in October of 1940. So here you see some fresh-faced, young, enthusiastic young men who are going off to military service. They believe they were only going off for 1 year of military service. They, of course, didn't know what lay ahead. And among the communities that sent soldiers off for this mobilization in 1940 were soldiers from Waupaca County. In particular, the anti-tank company of the 127th Infantry Regiment from Waupaca. You see the photograph here of them marching off to the train station. And from Clintonville, there was Company A of the 107th Quartermasters. So they're among the soldiers who are going off for mobilization. And even though this was supposed to only be for 1 year, you can imagine that it was a very emotional experience. Young men going away from home for the first time. You can imagine what their parents were thinking. And I've got here a quote from the Waupaca County Post that described the scene here in Waupaca as the anti-tank company went off. It's a little bit lengthy, so bear with me here, but it's really kind of a poignant story. Quote, "There wasn't much laughing on the depot platform Monday afternoon when the National Guardsmen left. A large crowd was on hand, not a laughing, cheering crowd, but a thoughtful crowd of serious-minded folks who were deeply moved, and they contemplated the probability that those youngsters were going to be from their hometown for a year, and that year might drag into 3 or 4 or 5, and that several of those boys quite possibly were taking their last glimpse Monday of this sleepy little Wisconsin town set among the colorful hills in radiant October. The high school band, helped by relieving the tenseness that everyone felt. The blare of the band kind of covered up the words that weren't being said. The boys bore up better than anyone else, wisecracking a bit, kidding about their little trip. Then the train's whistle sounded a signal, and there was much waving of hands and handkerchiefs and hats, and a little restrained cheering as the troop train pulled out. As it roared down the grade, the people slowly turned as though just recalling that they had something else to do, and they slowly walked back to their cars and their jobs and were swallowed up by the cold, raw October afternoon, even as their thoughts were swallowed up by fearful premonition that maybe this was just the start of it. And of course, we all know how the story turns out, right? This was just the start of their involvement in history's greatest wars. Already, right from the beginning, you can see how this affected the entire community. Well, the Red Arrow left Wisconsin and Michigan, and they trained in Louisiana at Camp Beauregard, and then later at Camp Livingston. Both are located near Alexandria, Louisiana, in the central part of the state. Here they absorbed draftees. At this point, the Army assigned draftees to National Guard divisions from the home state of the draftees. So when new soldiers came into the division, they tended to come from Wisconsin and Michigan. And so that upper Midwestern character of the 32nd Division remained in place during the training period here. And they learned more about soldiering. They did lots of other tasks that soldiers have to do. Here you see young men peeling potatoes, for example, KP duty, which was greatly hated and oftentimes a punishment for soldiers. And they also played war games. In the summer of 1941 in particular, Louisiana basically became one big scene for war games, and local soldiers participated in this as well. In fact, some local soldiers were even involved in defeating the famous General George Patton. The Germans never could, but some members of the 32nd Division could. It's war games, of course. So here was the situation. General Patton was already a famous person by this time. He was a pioneer in creating American armored forces. And these are the days of Hitler's Blitzkrieg, right? And America really needed to get its armored forces in shape. When America first mobilizes, we really didn't even have enough tanks. There were trucks with a sign on their side that said tank. That's how some of the training took place. So they're really trying to get soldiers up to speed on tank warfare, not only in conducting it, but stopping it as well. And that's where the anti-tank troops come in, including the company that came from Waupaca. So there was one war game in August of 1945 where General Patton was moving forward, and members of the anti-tank battalion of the 32nd Division went in to stop them. And here's how the Wisconsin National Guard Review described the action. Quote, "The Provisional Anti-Tank Battalion, warned in time and heavily armed with 35mm guns and 75mm guns, scurried ahead and to the sides and literally saved the day. Many tanks were captured." So we beat Patton, right? Good for us. It was also while the division was in Louisiana that they got word of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. And war games suddenly become much more serious. In early 1942, the division is reorganized. There were a lot of people coming into the division. A lot of people were leaving the division. Many of those coming into the division were not from Wisconsin or Michigan. What you start to see is that upper Midwestern character of the division starting to change. Many officers, for example, came from the South. And the 32nd Division was also on the move very quickly after Pearl Harbor. In February of 1942, it was sent to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The 32nd Division was originally slated to go to Europe, and this was a camp that was preparing soldiers for shipment to Northern Ireland. But then things changed. As I noted before, not only was there a war in Europe, there was also a war in the Pacific. And in early 1942, the situation in the Pacific was getting very, very dangerous. American and Filipino forces were holding on to the little pieces of the Philippines and were about to be defeated. And in particular, Australia was threatened by the Japanese, and Australia was virtually defenseless. Australia had been fighting with the British. Australia's combat soldiers were mostly in the Mediterranean, fighting the Germans, and now that the Japanese are threatening Australia, there were very few troops to stop any potential attacks. So Australia really needed help. And the United States begins to send troops to the Pacific. And one of the divisions that they sent to the Pacific was the 32nd, which meant that they had to move all the way from the East Coast in New England, get on trains, and then take a rail journey across the continental United States. They went to San Francisco, where they boarded ships, and then took a 3-week ocean voyage to Adelaide, Australia. They arrived there in May of 1942. They were there for about 2 months, and then they moved to another camp called Camp Cable near Brisbane, which was farther north and closer to where the action was undoubtedly going to be. So in the first 6 months of World War II, the Red Arrow Division traveled more than most people probably did in their entire lives. And this is still just the beginning here. Here's the American leadership team. This does not include the Australians, and I want to be very clear, we're fighting alongside the Australians, but I need to keep this presentation brief and clear, so all due respect to any Australians who are out there. We're going to focus only on the Americans here. The commander of what was known as the Southwest Pacific area was General Douglas MacArthur, another one of America's most famous soldiers, and a soldier with Wisconsin connections, I might point out. It was his father during the Civil War, leading a charge of a Wisconsin regiment, urging his troops forward. He told them, "On Wisconsin." And of course, we all know that song now, right? So he coined that phrase, essentially. So MacArthur had these Wisconsin connections. He had just basically been kicked out of the Philippines. President Roosevelt evacuated him before he would be captured by the Japanese. And he promised that he would return to the Philippines. And this becomes one of his obsessions. There were 2 American divisions in Australia at this time, the 32nd and the 41st. They comprised what was known as I Corps, or the 1st Corps, under the command of General Robert Eichelberger. And the commander of the 32nd Division was General Edwin Forrest Harding, who was a West Point classmate of General Harding. The regular army was kind of a small community in many ways. My slides are mixed up. And so it was pretty clear that they were going to go to New Guinea, that this would be the place they would meet the Japanese. So let's take a look at the map and let me try to set up the situation. The fighting would take place on New Guinea's Papuan Peninsula. This is a far eastern part of New Guinea. It's a large island just to the north of Australia. And in July of 1942, Japanese forces invaded the northern coast of Papua at a place called Buna. And then they marched inland through the jungles, through the mountains, heading for the southern side of the island in a place called Port Moresby. This was held by the Australians. This was Australia's administrative center for the island. And the Japanese got pretty close to Port Moresby. They got within about 30 miles or so. Here again, things seem desperate. Australia's rushing what soldiers it can up to New Guinea. Some of those soldiers from the Mediterranean are now beginning to make their way to New Guinea, but they need more. And General MacArthur decides to send in the 32nd Division. The first elements of the 32nd Division arrived by plane in September of 1942. It was just one company, but this was an important first in American military history. This is the first time that American soldiers had ever been flown into a combat zone before. The 128th Infantry Regiment also was flown in. That regiment was made up mostly of Wisconsin soldiers. The 126th Infantry Regiment made up mostly of Michigan soldiers. It took the boat and took much longer to get there. And the 127th, which included Waupaca's anti-tank company, it stayed behind in reserve for now. So it was the 126th and the 128th that make their way to New Guinea. Now they're in an official combat zone. And they're on the eve of their first combat. Now the Red Arrow soldiers themselves were very, very confident. But in fact, they were remarkably unprepared for what lay ahead. And when they finally met the Japanese, it would be an incredible shock. The division, for example, its training was inadequate. Its equipment was inadequate. In Louisiana, it trained for European warfare, not for jungle warfare as would be seen in the Pacific. And once the division got to Australia, the training really didn't change very much. As Eichelberger complained, it was more of the same. They had no specialized jungle equipment, no jungle boots, no jungle fatigues. In fact, interesting story, they didn't have any real combat fatigues at all. So they took their denim uniforms, dyed them green, and then sent them off to the battlefield. Right? They didn't have boots, they had shoes to fight in the jungle. So they really didn't have the equipment, they really didn't have the training to fight in the jungle. One other thing that was hindering their training was the fact that they were constantly on the move. They were not in one place for any more than about 2 months or so, and that's not good for readiness either. The division had questionable leadership at all levels, I should point out. As some of you are probably aware, there's oftentimes a lot of tension between the regular army and the National Guard. And the regular army oftentimes complains about the weekend warriors and those sorts of things. And the army was very concerned about the quality of the division's leadership. And in fact, many of the division's officers had been dismissed or transferred and oftentimes replaced by reservists. Reservists who also did not have very much experience. Some of you may have heard the term 90-day wonder before, right? Officers who were very quickly trained and then sent off to command troops, oftentimes very unfamiliar with the military environment. So some National Guard officers remained, but there were many new and experienced officers as well. And let me pick on General MacArthur for a minute here as well. As we're going to see tonight, he and the 32nd Division had a rather tense relationship. MacArthur is famous for being an egomaniac, someone who always craved the headlines and oftentimes did not want to share credit for accomplishments. I will also note that he had basically lost the battle in the Philippines, and he wanted to redeem himself. If he lost the Philippines and then New Guinea, that would probably be the end of his career. I should also note that the Marine Corps and the Navy at this very same time are fighting in the Solomon Islands at a place called Guadalcanal. And there was a lot of rivalry between the Army and the Navy. And MacArthur wanted to win a victory before the Navy and the Marines did at Pearl Harbor. So he had a lot of pressure on him, and he put a lot of pressure on himself, and he also put a lot of pressure on those under his command as well. Some other things, poor intelligence. Basically, the Allies had no idea how many Japanese they were facing, and they constantly underestimated how many Japanese were at Buna and the quality of Japanese troops. American intelligence suggested that there were probably no more than 2,000 Japanese at Buna who were so tired and sick with malaria that they would not put up much of a fight. As General Harding said, Buna would be quote unquote easy pickings, right? They weren't expecting a big battle. They were expecting to walk in and take over and enjoy the fruits of victory. And as we'll see in a minute, that's not what happened. They didn't really know what they were walking into. And very little naval support. I'll throw one more thing in here as well. The Navy, as I noted, was already fighting at Guadalcanal. It didn't have a lot to spare for MacArthur, and the Navy didn't really want to spare MacArthur very much anyway. And this would complicate the battle significantly. You know, when we think of the movies we've watched, let's say, or books we've read about World War II in the Pacific, they're always attacking islands from landing craft, right? Well, that's not what happens at Buna. They didn't have any landing craft. They would have to approach Buna by land. And that was exceptionally difficult. New Guinea was a very difficult place to fight. This was an island that was covered with jungle, thick, dense jungle. Many Wisconsin and Michigan soldiers were hunters. Many had been deer hunting and these sorts of things, and they knew how to survive in the woods, but not these woods. This is something different. Average daytime temperatures were about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and humidity, like, it's been a warm summer, just imagine that all the time. And that's effectively what New Guinea is like. And then about November and December, the monsoon comes, and when it's not blazing hot and sticky, it's pouring rain. So it was a very, very difficult environment. And if they weren't fighting in jungle, there were high mountains, there were swamps that were filled not only with crocodiles. What really gave the 32nd Division difficulty was the little mosquito, which carried malaria in particular, but other tropical diseases as well. So a very, very difficult environment to fight in. This was not the fields of France. This in turn created a logistical nightmare. New Guinea was a place where there were practically no roads. Except for Port Moresby, no modern ports whatsoever. Many of the waters off the coast had not even really been charted before. So how do you move soldiers and how do you move equipment up to the battlefront? The soldiers had to march through the jungle or were sometimes carried by water. This is how much of their many of their supplies got to got to the front as well. But because of the lack of naval support, what they really depended on were a number of rather small ships. It's kind of not to get too far off on this, an interesting story. They had to round up like pleasure craft and other sorts of things from around Australia. You can see one in the background here. These rather small boats are sort of brought into Army service, and they're used to bring supplies forward. There's no piers, right? You notice how they get this artillery piece on shore. You have to sort of take it by lugger. And I should note that at this point, the Japanese largely controlled the skies. So they had to operate mostly at night because during the day they were very vulnerable to Japanese planes, who did in fact attack several times. So only further adding to the difficulties of this fight. The Allies, to a significant degree, really depended on the Papua New Guinean population. As I noted before, the eastern half of New Guinea was an Australian colony, and the Australians mobilized the island population for labor, oftentimes coercively, I should point out. But the Allied war effort, to a significant degree, depended on them. Any roads or ports that are being built, this was typically done by Papua New Guinean laborers. They oftentimes carried supplies for the 32nd Division up to the front. They served as guides, which of course was very important in this unfamiliar environment, carried wounded soldiers from the battlefield. Many American soldiers, in fact, developed an affection for Papua New Guinean carriers. If you're a wounded soldier and they're carrying you away from the battlefield, you can see where you might have some affection for them. So they're oftentimes a forgotten part of the story of the fighting on New Guinea, but the 32nd Division and other Allied units certainly depended on them. All right, so let's go back to the map and let's see what's happening here. Now it's November of 1942, and American and Australian forces are beginning to approach Japanese positions on the northern coast. And if you look on the map on the left, it's not entirely clear. The Japanese were held up in 3 pockets along the north coast. On the far west was a pocket around a village called Gona. In the middle was a pocket around a village called Sanananda. And on the far east was a pocket around Buna. So the Allies had to reduce these 3 areas. Gona would be reduced exclusively by the Australians. Sanananda would mostly be reduced by the Australians, although there was 1 battalion from the 126th Infantry Regiment that was fighting with the Australians at Sanananda. But the Red Arrow Division and General Harding, their job was to attack Buna. And the map on the right gives a bit of a close-up of the Buna battlefield. On the far east was a coconut plantation called the Duropa Plantation. So it's relatively flat and coastal with rows of coconut palms. There were 2 airfields there, only 1 was operational. And on the far west was a village called Buna Village. And just a little farther, a little bit of ways from there was a spot called the Buna Government Station, which American soldiers mistakenly but persistently called Buna Mission. And located in between those 2 positions were impenetrable swamps. Now again, because the Red Arrow did not have landing craft and they were not going to come in by sea, they had to come over land. passing through many of those swamps was not going to be possible. And at any possible place where the Americans might come in, the Japanese built lots of bunkers, trenches, other sorts of fortifications. And as you can see in the picture here, they're very well camouflaged. They were very difficult to spot, and Red Arrow soldiers weren't really expecting this. If you look at this photograph carefully, you can see a soldier in there. You spot him, right? Just to give you a sense of how well camouflaged the Japanese were and how well dug in they were as well. So the order to attack came on November the 15th, and the Red Arrow Division goes into action. Their first attack was on November the 19th on the Duropa plantation. This was a section of the battlefield that was called the Warren Front. And on November 21st, other elements of the Red Arrow attacked Buna Village and Buna Mission. And this becomes known as the Urbana Front. And this is where the 127th would eventually fight when they get to New Guinea. And as I noted before, they were not prepared. And the first time Japanese bullets come streaking in was a profound shock. Here's how one soldier described it, Roy Campbell, he's from Eau Claire. Quote, "Men fell all around, many mortally wounded. Some with legs riddled with bullets sank to the ground crying and moaning. The guns kept firing, and many of those who had fallen were hit again, killing them." It was just utter shock that they experienced. Again, they were expecting easy pickings, as General Harding said, and that's not what happened. So this first combat is oftentimes referred to as the baptism of fire. And that's difficult for any soldier. And to a very significant degree, no training can really prepare you for the real thing. But this baptism of fire seemed to be particularly profoundly difficult. And so the Red Arrow Division made very slow progress. They measured their gains in yards. And General MacArthur was becoming quite frustrated. General MacArthur did not get near the front lines. He was back at Port Moresby looking at the situation on a map and didn't understand why they weren't going forward. And he largely blamed the division's officers for not being good enough and not being aggressive enough. And he was also very critical of General Harding. So he sends I Corps Commander General Eichelberger to Buna to relieve Harding and take command. And here's the parting words that MacArthur had for Eichelberger, quote, "Take Buna or don't come back alive." Now, I suppose you can interpret that in many ways. It's fighting words. Maybe it also represents a casualness about casualties. I guess we can interpret this in different ways. But that was Eichelberger's send-off for Buna. Now, by December of 1942, the Red Arrow Division does start to make some progress. They learn the battlefield the hard way. They learned how to reduce bunkers, how to spot them, and gained that experience on the battlefield, which was critical. I might also note that there were a few members of the division who had some battlefield experience. And in this one particular case, it turned out to be critical. One of the most interesting members of the 32nd Division was a man named Hermann Bottcher, who was born in Germany and who hated fascism so much that he joined Germany's communist movement. He eventually leaves Germany. He settles in the United States. Then in the 1930s, he goes off to Spain to fight against fascism there. He had this burning hatred of fascism. He comes back to the United States, and then it was 1 or 2 days after Pearl Harbor, he shows up at a U.S. Army recruiting office. Now you've got to imagine the recruiter thinking, here's a German communist, and he wants to join the army. But they needed bodies, and he knew how to fight, and he was very enthusiastic. So they took him, he becomes Sergeant Botcher, and on December the 5th of 1942, he leads a charge against Japanese lines, and he basically punches a hole in them between Buna Village and Buna Mission. And he holds it. This becomes known as Botcher's Corner, and he separates two very important positions that the Japanese held. Right, so it's this kind of experience that now begins to show itself on the battlefield, and progress starts to be made. This is also when the 127th Infantry Regiment makes its way to the front. They had been held in reserve, but in December, now they reach the battlefield. This gives the Red Arrow Division fresh troops, more troops at a very, very important time. The logistical situation begins to improve as well. Engineers did a tremendous job of building port facilities so that they could bring in bigger ships and more of them. They built a complex of airfields which could fly in supplies and fly wounded soldiers out. Road building here to link all these different parts of the battlefield together. And here's a local connection, a Waupaca County connection here as well. There was an officer in the quartermaster company named John Pinkowski. When we think about the quartermaster, we usually think that these are soldiers who are behind the lines, oftentimes are considered to be fairly safe. But again, in this environment in New Guinea, the relaying those supplies to the front, this was a dangerous job. And on December the 23rd of 1942, Japanese planes attacked one of these supply convoys. And Lieutenant Pinkowski won the Silver Star, America's second highest military decoration, in fighting off the Japanese attack. A decoration like this is usually only given to infantry soldiers or those who are more traditionally, combat soldiers. But in an environment like this, an attack can come anywhere, and quartermaster soldiers can also show their skill and valor as well. But what really helped to turn the tide was the arrival of the arrival of Australian tanks. With this improved supply line, they were able to bring tanks up to the front, and on December the 18th, these Australian tanks attacked. And this allows the 32nd Division and their Australian allies to now finally begin to take much larger amounts of territory. Those tanks were able to blast through those bunkers and defenses in a way that the foot soldiers and the meager artillery that they had really couldn't do it. And by this time, American strength is growing. Japanese strength is weakening. They're running out of troops. They're running out of supplies. So there's still a lot of really hard fighting around Christmas time and up to New Year's. But Buna Mission finally falls on January 2nd of 1943. And so the Buna pocket now has finally been reduced. Now there's still the Sanananda pocket to worry about, and this was largely an Australian operation. But their 127th Infantry Division Regiment did participate in this as well. They attacked along the coast towards Australian positions, and the battle was finally declared over on January 22nd of 1943. And at that point, the whole Papuan campaign had come to an end. And it came to an end with a complete Allied victory. And just about 2 weeks later, Guadalcanal finally was secured by the Marines. And so both of those battles come to an end at about the same time, but the battle in New Guinea came to an end first. So the 32nd Division participated in the first Allied victory, on land anyway, against the Japanese. And Guadalcanal is one of those World War II battles that many people remember, have heard the stories, there have been movies about it, and the plucky Marines kept on fighting and defeated the Japanese. And you could say the same thing about the Red Arrow Division. But the Red Arrow Division, its reputation was very different after its victory at Buna. There were many in Army leadership in MacArthur's headquarters who were still angry at the 32nd Division, still didn't respect its fighting capabilities. Now, not everybody in MacArthur's headquarters thought that. Eichelberger, for example, who commanded the last phases of the battle at Buna, certainly did not think that. But here's what he wrote in his memoir, quote, "A great deal has been said and whispered about the 32nd Division, and much of it makes no sense. The 32nd, which failed at Buna, was the same 32nd that won the victory there. No one else did." Right? Eichelberger was right, in my humble opinion. But many in Army leadership did not think much of the 32nd Division. Now, as for the soldiers themselves, they were, first of all, happy it was over, and second of all, very proud of what they accomplished. Here's what one soldier, James Myers, wrote in his memoir, quote, "We fought the Japanese, we fought the jungle, the rain and mud, the insects, swamps and diseases, and we won." And just one little fun fact here, by the way. Myers was from Philadelphia, and a few years after the war, he co-authored a song called "Rock Around the Clock." Have you heard this song before? Right? Helped to usher in rock and roll as a musical genre. That came in the 50s, of course, but he had long been involved in Philadelphia's entertainment scene. So they won, but it kind of felt like a loss in some ways. Now, after the devastating fight at Buna, the 32nd Division was out of action for about a year. It got a new commander, General William Gill, who had a reputation for being a strict disciplinarian, and I should note, not very popular with many of the troops. Training intensified greatly, now informed by the hard-learned experiences at Buna. You would sometimes hear Red Arrow Division soldiers say, "We wrote the book on jungle warfare," and they really weren't that far off. Those lessons learned at Buna would be applied throughout the war in the Pacific. Replacements begin to come in. These replacements do not just come from Wisconsin and Michigan, they come from across the nation. So here you really start to see that upper Midwestern character of the division start to change significantly. There are some stories about the Red Arrow Division in the national press. Life magazine ran a few features, for example. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt paid them a visit while they were in Australia. And then in early 1944, rotations home start. by early 1944, some soldiers had already been overseas for 2 years. And this is when many, not all to be clear, but many of the original National Guard contingent begins to come home. And after 1944, the Red Arrow really isn't an upper Midwestern division anymore. It's really much more of a division that encompasses the entire nation. Now, in 1944, the Army and the Navy began their famous leapfrogging campaign across the Pacific, bypassing Japanese strong points, trying to get as close to the Philippines and Japan as quickly as they could. And the Red Arrow participated in these as well, in some relatively minor engagements. At a place called Sidor, for example, on the north coast of New Guinea, Red Arrow soldiers attacked in January of 1944. They took a Japanese airfield. Later, a naval base was built here. In April of 1944, they took another Japanese airfield at a place called Aitape. And they endured a pretty stiff Japanese counterattack, but once again prevailed on the battlefield. But by later in 1944, the Red Arrow Division starts to engage in some bigger battles. Two, in fact, that, like Buna, almost brought the division to the brink of collapse. It was in October of 1944 that General MacArthur finally returns to the Philippines as promised. And he invades an island in the Philippines called Leyte. In November of 1944, the Red Arrow Division is sent in to Leyte. And it does much of its fighting along the northern shore at a place called Breakneck Ridge. Now, the name itself, I think, probably suggests what was going on there. This was another place where the Japanese had basically barricaded themselves in. They had dug in, and Red Arrow soldiers had to go in there and take them out one bunker at a time. Progress was slow. Progress was too slow for General MacArthur. And as Eichelberger recorded in his diary, Big Chief, meaning MacArthur, of course, Big Chief stated that the 32nd had never been any good. And this was unfair and it was untrue. In fact, the 32nd Division basically broke open a pathway along the highway that allowed other divisions to go move forward and take a very important port city. But it was the Red Arrow that basically unlocked that door. But once again, MacArthur's grudge against the 32nd Division resurfaces. And then after just a few weeks' rest, the division is sent to the island of Luzon. That's the largest and most important of the Philippine islands. And here they fought along a pathway known as the Villa Verde Trail. This was a link between the lowlands and the Cagayan Valley, a very fertile valley to the north. They had to go through those mountains to reach the Japanese on the northern part of the island. Now, this Villa Verde Trail in many places was little more than a footpath that had been created by a Spanish missionary in the 1800s. And here again, the Japanese built elaborate fortifications in the hills and valleys of a mountain pass. And so there was a very bitter fight for every single hill. The hundreds of caves that the Japanese had dug into the hillsides had to be eliminated one by one. Once again, casualties were horrendous. The fighting was very tough. And I should note not just the physical casualties, but the psychological casualties were quite significant. By this time, there were still some soldiers left from the old National Guard contingent, some soldiers who had been in action on and off for 4 years, and so you can imagine the toll that that took on many soldiers. So another really tough campaign, but by May of 1945, the Villa Verde Trail, in fact, had been cleared. And here again, let's pay tribute not just to the foot soldier. The engineers here did a remarkable job in taking that footpath and turning it into a roadway capable of supporting tanks, self-propelled guns, ambulances, and these sorts of things to support the American move forward. Now, during the last months of the war, the Red Arrow Division was engaged in some minor fighting in northern Luzon. They're basically, along with other divisions, sort of closing in on the Japanese. The Japanese are reduced to a very small pocket in the mountains. And when Japan announced its intention to surrender on August the 15th of 1945, not all Japanese soldiers stopped fighting. In fact, ironically, I suppose, the Red Arrow Division was the first U.S. Army division to fight the Japanese, and even after the Japanese announced they were going to surrender, the Red Arrow Division is still in action. On September 2nd, the Japanese commander in the Philippines, General Yamashita Tomoyuki, he finally surrendered. So the Philippine campaign is over. The war is over. And after the war, American officials interrogated Yamashita. And he had some interesting things to say about the 32nd Division. Here's what General Walter Krieger recorded in his memoir. Quote, General Yamashita indicated that he considered the 32nd Division the best his troops encountered on both Leyte and Luzon. So while MacArthur did not seem to have very much respect for the 32nd Division, the Japanese most certainly did. And I suppose in war, that's the most important thing, right? And so after being involved in the war from beginning to end, the Red Arrow Division then goes to Japan and serves on occupation duty until it is finally demobilized in February of 1946. So that was 5.5 years on active service. So a very long road, a very long journey in many ways. The ultimate toll on the 32nd Division, more than 1,600 were killed. That's more than any other Army division in the Pacific. Battle-related deaths, those would be people who died of wounds, died of disease, accidents, those sorts of things, just a smidge over 2,000. More than 5,600 wounded. That was the third highest in the Pacific. Buna was by far the most costly battle. If you account for killed in action, wounded, accidents, there were no prisoners, but missing in action, disease, malaria, casualties approached 90%. So virtually no soldier emerged from the Battle of Buna in particular unscathed. By Leyte and Luzon, much more support, much better training, but those battles also saw very significant casualties. As I noted before, the Red Arrow Division represented some very important firsts in American military history: 654 days in combat, more than any other U.S. Army division in U.S. history. They were the first U.S. Army division to fly into a combat zone, the first one to meet the Japanese, and the first to defeat the Japanese, if not just by a few weeks of Guadalcanal. They did do it first. And 32nd Division soldiers developed a great pride in their unit. And if your fathers or grandfathers were in the unit, you may well be aware of how prideful many of them were. And sometimes it almost seemed like they had a chip on their shoulders, like they were being picked on and disrespected. In some respects, they were. Here's what one Red Arrow soldier wrote in the Saturday Evening Post. "They're quick to take issue by force if necessary with anyone who challenges the Red Arrow's impressive array of claims to top Pacific battle honors. Barroom brawls are on record as a result of conflicting claims." So yeah, they were proud of what they did. And yet the memory of the 32nd Division, as I noted at the beginning, it did seem to disappear somehow. The veterans oftentimes didn't like to talk about it. I hear people tell me all the time, my grandfather or my father was over there, he didn't say much about it, right? And I suppose that is perhaps why we lost track of the Red Arrow Division's accomplishments. It's also said that the Marine Corps is much better at publicity than the Army. I don't know if that's true. I gave a talk last night, and there was a Marine in the audience who reacted to that. So all due respect to the Marines, I don't disrespect the Marines, but they do seem to not only be able to fight, but have a good publicity record as well. Whatever the case may be. The memory of the 32nd Division did seem to fade. But now this year we have the 80th anniversary of the war's end, and this has increased some interest in the conflict. And so maybe we can reintroduce this 32nd Division into our national narrative about World War II. And in fact, World War II is an episode in history that many people find really fascinating. I know I do, and I suspect many of you do as well. And it's an episode in history that we sometimes, I think, mythologize. We like to think of World War II as the good war, and we talk about the greatest generation. And we really did accomplish some tremendous things. It really was a complete and total victory. We really were fighting evil, bloody regimes, right? It seemed to have a kind of moral clarity that many conflicts do not. But I think we do need to be concerned about mythologizing history too much. History and nostalgia are not the same things. If we only focus on the positive messages, I think we lose track of how people in the past really had to sacrifice to fight this war. We can't think of our greatest generation as somehow destined to victory as mythical supermen who, of course, they were going to win. I saw this movie on TV a few weeks ago. We need to keep in mind that they were ordinary people like any of us who came from cities and small towns like Waupaca and Clintonville and Manitowoc and Port Washington and all kinds of places who had to learn the hard way who had to sacrifice. Many didn't return. And if we mythologize the war too much, I think we lose track of what really happens in a war and what our predecessors really experienced. And on that note, if you're interested in the book, there's a lot more in the book. Otherwise, I thank you very much for your time and your attention this evening. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned very early in your talk that the initial intelligence assessments of the U.S. on Buna was maybe 2,000 Japanese, and they're probably really sick.
Yeah.
What was the real number of Japanese, or estimates of once they cleared up?
The actual number of Japanese was about at Buna was about 6,000.
Okay.
So they underestimated quite significantly. And again, the condition of the soldiers, in fact, the Japanese had been reinforced, and they were able, at the beginning of the battle, were able to bring in some reinforcements. And I'll also note that Japan had been basically fighting since 1937. So many of them had battle experience in China and the Philippines and other places in the Pacific. Yeah, there was a severe underestimation, not only in numbers, but of the fighting capability of the Japanese, which would, if you read some of the documents and memoirs later, some in MacArthur's headquarters complained that American soldiers sometimes went in the opposite direction after the battle started and thought about the Japanese as mythical fighting supermen who could not be defeated. Knowing what many people are familiar somewhat with the war in the Pacific, and the Japanese did in fact fight very tenaciously. Their military ethic was to never surrender, never take prisoners, would oftentimes fight to the very last person. So even if they were disease-ridden, and by the end they were, and exhausted and out of supplies, they still continued to fight until the very, very end. I forget the exact number of Japanese prisoners that the Allies took, but it was in the double digits. And many of the laborers that they conscripted, Chinese and Korean, they were happy to surrender. But the Japanese soldiers themselves oftentimes would commit suicide before they would give themselves up. So even given the faulty intelligence, what they really didn't understand was the Japanese military mentality as well. They adapted to it. But that was not really clear at first. Again, they're the first to go up against the Japanese. So that was another hard lesson that the Red Arrow learned for the rest of the U.S. Army.
Well, two things that you said, and I got some military experience, and I can tell you some great war stories, but the number of bullets that have been fired at me in my 22 years was absolutely zero. Now, my uncles from Vietnam, my uncles in World War II, the ones who really saw the action weren't the ones telling the great stories in the bars afterwards. They just want to forget. If you're in a place like Buna, you lose 90% or 90% casualties and things like that. You're in there, you're green, you're not trained, it's obvious. You're not going to be making headlines and things like that. You want to not even mention it in letters written back home, probably.
That is very true. And writing this or any other military history, you have to be very careful of your sources. Some people make themselves to be the hero of their own story. And I've read some memoirs and read some interviews that did not match up with the records that I came across. So that is true. Those who were really deep in the fighting oftentimes didn't say a word. Years ago, when I was in school, I worked at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison. And one of the things I did was run an oral history program. And there were only a handful of Buna veterans who agreed even to be interviewed. And it was difficult to sort of coax them to do so. And yeah, there was a modest streak in that generation that later generations did not seem to have. I think maybe one way why we admire them so much. I don't know if I answered your question or just babbled, but.
You clarified that.
All right, all right. I saw a hand up here, yes, sir.
Was there a European contingent of the 32nd Division also?
Oh, that's a good question. There was one little segment of the Red Arrow Division that ended up in Europe. Yeah. As I noted before, they were sent to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And the engineers usually go ahead to build a base and those sorts of things. So the 107th Engineers had been sent to Northern Ireland. And then the division got its orders to go to the Pacific, but the 107th Engineers, they were already in Ireland. So what the Red Arrow did, if I go back to this slide here, the 107th stayed in Europe. They were detached from the division, and added to the division was the 114th Engineers, which was Massachusetts National Guard. So there's quirky little stories like that. So there was one little segment that ended up in Europe, but the rest ended up in the Pacific. Yes, sir?
Are you familiar with the book, The Ghost Mountain Boys?
Yes.
Now, didn't they have to go over the mountains to get to Buda?
Some did, yes. I wanted to keep this to an hour because I know people are getting tired. And it was Michigan soldiers who did that trek over the mountains. But since you raised the question, I'll tell you that story also. Yes. If I go back to this map here. The Japanese were on the north side of the island. The Allies were on the south side of the island. How do you get across from the south side to the north side? But what the Australians did was they pushed the Japanese back over the mountains along what was called the Kokoda Track. So the Australians had a really, really hard time there. And what MacArthur wanted to do was go over the mountains to try to outflank the Japanese. And there was another pathway called the Kappa Kappa Track, which very few people had ever been on. Nobody was sure what it was like, but MacArthur sent a battalion from the 126th Infantry Regiment over that track. They came across mountains that were 9,000 feet high. Very dense jungle, and then when you got into the mountains, it got cold. Those on the march talked about being able to see your breath. There was one soldier who commented, you know, we don't know when we crossed the crest of the mountains because there was no sign, but if there had been a sign, we would have burned it to keep warm. So you can imagine they're accustomed to the jungle, and now they're up in these very high mountains. And I'll add, by the way, the Papua New Guinean carriers, who didn't wear much in the way of Western-style clothing, they're also on this march in these very harsh environments and climbing up very steep cliffs, and the trail wasn't always clear. And when they emerged on the other side, they were not in very good shape for fighting. They still had to, but they were particularly ridden with disease and exhausted. So they found airfields on the north side and flew everyone else over. So most Red Arrow soldiers took another plane ride to the north side. That's a great question. I'm glad you answered that, because that's an important part of this story.
How many miles from side to side? South side, north side?
Yeah, it's about 90, maybe 100, I believe, and that's as the crow flies. So when you think that there aren't roads and you got the mountain switchbacks and those sorts of things, the actual distance is going to be considerably longer, yeah, if not more than that sometimes, yeah. Yes?
A long time ago, the 1950s, what was the hoopla about MacArthur? I can remember he was on the cover of Post, but was he charged as being communist, or what was the hoopla on MacArthur?
In the 50s?
Yes.
Well, MacArthur did ultimately emerge from World War II, a great hero. He was basically the military governor of Japan. And then I think you're thinking about the Korean War. And MacArthur was
They were charging him for something.
they were
I
charged,
don't remember.
not with being a
I was
communist.
not very old at that.
Yeah, no, MacArthur was very anti-communist. He was charged with insubordination. He was urging, this is during the Korean War, and he was urging more attacks on North Korea and communist China, and was saying and doing things that went against what President Truman wanted, and so Truman relieved him of command. So he had a big parade when he got home, and some people thought he was insubordinate, and some people thought he was taking the fight to communism. So people looked at his behavior in different ways. He was could be a divisive figure. Some people disliked him, some people thought he was great. I think that's what you're thinking of. Yeah, you were next. Yes, sir.
Do you know much about glider troopers in New Guinea, American glider troopers?
They were not with the 32nd Division.
Correct.
There was, I think it was a paratrooper operation in New Guinea in 1943 at a place called Nadzab. Offhand, I can't think of gliders, although I'm sure there probably were some. Maybe more in the Philippines. I'm not sure about New
My
Guinea.
dad was a glider trooper in New Guinea. They made 2 sorties. That was before the 32nd got there. He was with half Australians, half Americans, and the gliders weren't panning out.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that.
They had landed
You got me.
in what was supposed to be elephant grass, that kunai grass.
Yeah.
But it turned out that one of their sorties was bamboo, and most of the guys were killed, never got out of the gliders.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that story. I'd like to learn more. If you have more information, I'd be curious. Any other questions? Happy to do it. Yes, sir.
Going back to MacArthur, as much of a jerk as he was, I think one of his saving graces was the way he governed Japan after the war.
Yeah, like I think I said, I don't want to sound like I'm bad-mouthing MacArthur here. He was a complex figure. Yes, his governorship of Japan was really quite. He basically laid the groundwork for a modern democratic Japan that we have today. Even on the battlefield, he was one of the older generals, and the older ones are sometimes sort of stuck in the past, right? The admirals always liked the battleship, when in fact the aircraft carrier was far more important. MacArthur understood the importance of things like air power. So there were so many battles in the Pacific that were about grabbing an airfield. So he militarily understood warfare and conducted it well. I mean, he stumbled in the Philippines. That's a whole different story. There's a lot of criticism about his generalship in the Philippines, but he recovered from that, and he successfully returned to the Philippines and got to Japan, commanded UN forces in the Korean War. So again, he's sort of a mixed and divisive figure. Kind of a jerk, but he got stuff done, and maybe you need that sometime. That's what some people think. Rather like a Patton-like figure, I guess, who was also very effective and controversial as well. Yes, I'm not picking on MacArthur, but if I'm telling the story of the 32nd Division, I have to say that many people in the 32nd Division did not have warm fuzzies for General MacArthur. That's all I can say. Other questions? Well then, thank you very much for coming. Again, I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.